Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 is one of the most infamously awful video games in the entire history of the medium. The last thing in the world that the internet needs now is yet another video breaking down every last reason why. So, you keep geeking, I'll keep... Alright, I can be better than that. But seriously, what do I even say? We've endured 12 long years of game journalists and self-styled critics alike leaning on it as an easy shorthand anytime we need to talk about Sonic, making sure that every single person on the planet is keenly aware of this, and the implications of that. Whether you prefer your game criticism straight, snarky, or screaming, low-key and analytical, or ostentatious and hyperbolic, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories, reviews, and retrospectives, all centered around this one game. History has proven time and time again, it is easy, fun, profitable, and quite often hilarious to talk about Sonic 06. The game is both universal and inescapable. Even if you've never played it, you already know it's garbage, and you know what makes it garbage. This presents a problem. With so much content out there, what can I say that hasn't already been said? I'm not kidding, trying to figure out how to even approach such a well-worn subject is an absolutely daunting task. But there is one thing that I've got going for me when it comes to this series. I was there. I'm not just playing this game years after the fact so I can make a video about it. I was part of the online community for at least a decade before Sonic 06 was even announced. So drawing on that experience, I'm going to say something that is, frankly, unbelievable given how the game turned out. It was a long time ago, but everyone was really, genuinely excited about the next-gen Sonic game. It was for most of us a cautious optimism, given what we'd already been through, but it was optimism all the same. We all wanted to believe that all the missteps the series had taken were just aberrations, and that Sonic Team was ready to get things back on track. In fact, that was the crux of the game's reveal. In September 2005, more than a year before release, Yuji Naka, the last remaining part of the original Sonic team, made us a promise. With Sonic the Hedgehog, we have gone back to our starting point, more than 15 years ago, to reinvent the attitude and speed that made our hero a legend. The rebirth of Sonic will offer an unparalleled sense of speed that is only possible using the processing power afforded by the new systems. And that's a very critical point. The power of the next generation. One of the first things we learned about this game is that it arose from a simple question. What if Sonic the Hedgehog lived in the real world? Yeah, it's real easy with hindsight to mock the very concept of that question. That's a horrible idea. Why would anyone want to see that? But you have to understand the context of the time. We live now in an era where cross-generational improvements have become more iterative than revolutionary, and it may be hard to comprehend just how much faster, how much more spectacular, and most importantly, how much more true to life the next generation used to be. The best way to illustrate this is to compare video game graphics to something that actually is real life. And what could be more real than this? Famous WrestleMan Triple H has been spewing his water all over himself for almost 20 years, and video games have been trying to capture that magic for just as long. In 2006, going from what was a reasonable facsimile of a human being, all the way to this sweaty monstrosity, showed a tremendous leap in visual fidelity. And I'm not cheating this comparison by using different games. This is the exact same title running on two very different generations of hardware. We've certainly made some degree of progress since then, but the rate of improvement year over year has slowed down. So when it comes to realism, there's only so much further we can push it. It's no accident that the past 10 years or so have seen industry trends finally moving away from obsessively chasing realism as the ultimate end goal of graphical design. But in the mid-2000s, in an era where a game that looked, just like real life, was still such a selling point, it is no accident that Sonic Team's rebirth of their namesake came out looking the way it did. Just like it was no accident a generation before, when the Adventure series, 2 in particular, also tried for a more realistic take on Sonic. That raises another good point. We were 7 years removed from the last time the series reinvented itself. Here's the classic model. Timeless. Then they ran the adventure filter over it, reshaping the characters for 3 dimensions, bestowing upon us longer-limbed heroes with colorful eyes, living alongside adorable low-poly anime humans. So when Sonic Team at last had the technology at their fingertips to make Sonic real, how did they do that? Simple. They just applied the adventure filter another 7 or 8 times, creating an elongated Sonic with his spines flapping in the breeze, running around an oceanside city of humans so generic you'd swear they were just the default models packed with the engine. And yet, every single time Sega would see fit to give us a little peek, every time we got to see this game, almost every one of us fell all over ourselves at how gosh darn incredible it looked. And why? Because in 2005, it was still so unbelievable to see a game that looked this real. And you know, putting myself back in that mindset, I still think shots like this look pretty incredible. Sega's marketing for this game, I can say with hindsight, was nothing short of brilliant. Insidiously brilliant, but brilliant all the same. The teaser video told a nice little story and got our mouths watering at what next-gen hardware could do for a Sonic game. And from there, it was a slow, steady trickle of highly composed screenshots, tightly scripted videos, and carefully controlled live demonstrations. At E3 2006, we were confronted with a build of the game where Sonic's movement speed got faster as he collected rings, with a quicker homing attack, and animations that the final game is inexplicably missing. The E3 build is still the closest thing we've ever seen to a polished, complete version of Sonic 06. But of course, Sonic 06 ain't even what we called it back then. No, back then we differentiated this game from its 16-bit ancestor by calling it Sonic Next. So frantic was the frenzy that Sega had whipped us into at the sheer potential of what the next generation of Sonic might be. What it might be. Because we really didn't have a whole lot of hard evidence to go off of. At last, the sun rose on November 14th, 2006, and it quickly became clear that everything we had felt had been misplaced. Every single thing about this game was wrong. Now, mainstream reviewers did their job and raked the game over the coals, but scores like these pale in comparison to the unbridled vitriol of the Sonic fanbase. We were sold a bill of lies, and a whole lot of us were pretty freaking angry about it. I remember one particular friend of mine reviewed this game for his Zynga, like anyone knows what a Zynga is, and in the middle of the review was this 72-point font screaming 5 words. Sonic the Hedgehog is dead. Yeah, that summed it up. It seemed like everyone in the world hated this game. Except for me. Not because I thought it was any good. I just didn't have the means to pass judgment. At the time, I was 2 months into my first year of college. $460 plus tax was more money than I'd ever had at once in my entire life. But that's what it would have taken for me to get an Xbox 360, along with a game that everyone assured me would not be worth my time, let alone my money. And yet that forced distance kind of worked to the game's advantage. I was excited before release, along with everyone else, sure, but I couldn't be too let down by a game that I couldn't have played anyway. And as the seasons passed over the next year, a funny thing happened. The more I learned about Sonic 06, the more angry and derisive people got about what a god-awful, worthless experience it was. My hype started to come back, but now it was flowing in the opposite direction. I would see Sonic 06 on store shelves, and I'd feel this morbid curiosity. I needed, more and more, to experience this dumpster fire for myself. And eventually, I would have the opportunity. I stood outside of a Walmart at 5:30 a.m. the day after Christmas in 2007. I had been gifted just enough money to procure an Xbox 360 of my own. I knew I was getting it for one reason: to play a game that everyone said was an abomination. But no matter how bad the game itself would be, what I couldn't have predicted even then, 11 years ago, was just how much damage Sonic 06 would do to the reputation of this franchise and to Sega itself. The day of fate has finally come. There's something I need to make clear right up front. Sonic 06 is a defective, deplorable game. I don't want this video to be misconstrued as any sort of attempt to repudiate that. Just because I don't hate dead horses enough to do a point-by-point deconstruction of every single one of the game's many flaws, doesn't mean that I'm trying to deny them. The difference with me is that none of these elements, not even that one, ever made me angry. Of course, a big part of that was just the fact that I was prepared, on some level, for what I was getting myself into. My first time playing Sonic 06 was the exact inverse of my experience with Heroes. I went into this game totally bereft of any expectation of quality, and yet despite all the warnings, I still fell into the same trap that everybody else does. You know, you start the game, see that somebody on the dev team sure loved Final Fantasy, get lost in a bland hub with no waypoints, start a mission, struggle with the horrible air physics, be flabbergasted that the very first thing Sonic does now that he's in the real world is fly through some giant orange rings, be way more flabbergasted by load times that are even longer and even more frequent than the stories foretold, buy the light dash, find the first level, clumsily scratch and claw your way through Wave Ocean, arrive at that first auto-running section, and die until you can die no more. And after all that, you find out that because you didn't remember to make a manual save before you went into Wave Ocean, you get to start the entire thing over from the beginning. It really is obvious how Sonic 06 earned its reputation, making you grind your way through such a poorly conveyed, confusing, and unsatisfying opening for upwards of half an hour, then telling you that, oops, you have to do it all again, is the worst first impression a game could make. And this is a series that normally, if nothing else, makes a pretty good first impression. But even if I experienced the same things that everyone else did, I did not have the same takeaway from it. I had been chomping at the bit to experience this madness for over a year, and on that level, Sonic 06 did not disappoint. On the contrary, it was hysterical, finally seeing this disturbingly realistic Eggman threaten what's supposed to be a modern-day princess, who still dresses like she's from medieval times. Every time I'd clip out of a loop or die in a scripted sequence or slow the game down to a crawl throwing dummy ring bombs, I didn't rage at it. I didn't worry about it. I would just smile.
Just smile.
Oh god, I've played this game too much. But really, I had read so many hot takes and seen so much acidic rage, and yet here I was, having way more fun than I even thought I would in the face of it all. And, well, there were at least a few, maybe teeny tiny things I was, kinda liking about it? To name a few. Like, yeah, okay, the whole aesthetic here is blatantly aping Final Fantasy, but man, they didn't skimp on the production values. These pre-rendered cutscenes are gorgeous if nothing else. Oh, and the way Sonic shows up, wrecks Eggman's plans without breaking a sweat, and then so effortlessly, so flippantly taps that bot off the edge. Yes! And like, even on the gameplay side, right? The physics and set pieces and hit detection are all just atrocious, but you know, the handling wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it'd be. While Sonic's ground speed is way too muddled, and his air speed is way too inconsistent, his actual handling is, if anything, responsive to the point of twitchy. That's not ideal, but I'll still take a control scheme that's too tight over this, and that kinda set the tone throughout my initial playthrough of Sonic's story. It lived up to my anti-hype and then some. It was every bit of the insurmountable mountain of garbage that I was hoping it would be, and yet it was interspersed with these little moments where I'd think to myself, huh, you know, that wasn't too bad. I must have been enjoying something about Sonic's campaign. After all, I grinded all the way to the end of it in only 4 days. And as I watched the credits roll on December 30th, 2007, as I listened to that strange remix of an ending theme that had meant so much to me, I wrote a post articulating my thoughts on a now-defunct message board called the Moogle Cavern. So here now, I'd like to read you 19-year-old Josh's immediate impressions upon completing Sonic's story. Look, this game has some major issues. Loading times are abysmal, Amigo characters are problematic, high-speed sections take some time to get good at, and the whole Sonic Elise love element is disturbing. Beneath all that, I think this is a pretty sweet game. The problems are not nearly as debilitating as most reviewers, and most people here for that matter, made them out to be. I say this as someone who has only played Sonic's Adventure, no Silver or Shadow yet. The levels are fun, the cutscenes are amazing, the plot is great! And honestly, the high-speed sections are some of my favorite parts. Now that I've gotten good at them, well, that proves it. 19 is still way too young to have the intellect or the experience to form good opinions. At least I couldn't. But alright, I can kinda see where classic Josh is coming from with some of that. Let's break it down, starting first and foremost with the most glaringly incorrect thing anyone's ever said about this game. The plot is great. What was I thinking? The only way the word great belongs anywhere near this game's story is if it's preceding a word that we don't use here on the Geek Critique. Why in the world would I have had anything positive to say about this plot, especially when the last thing I had seen before typing those words was this cutscene? Ugh. Princess Elise basically is to Sonic what Adam Malkovich is to Metroid, a character who is almost universally despised thanks to their ill-conceived relationship with the protagonist. Nobody wants to see Samus Aran so kowtowed by an authority figure, and nobody wants to see an uncanny human princess having romantic bonding moments with Sonic the Hedgehog. Except, well, somebody must have. The idea of Sonic having a human lady for a love interest stretches all the way back to concept art for the original game. Then you've got cases like Sarah from the anime OVA, who's ostensibly supposed to be a cat, but looks for all the world like a teenage anime girl wearing a Halloween costume. What may be a little surprising now is that there was a more innocent period of time when nobody batted an eye at this stuff. On the contrary, the so-called Madonna was an obvious ripoff of Jessica Rabbit, and come to think of it, nobody batted an eye at that either. Well, I mean, they did, but not for that reason. Human women and the adorable cartoon animals who loved them just seemed to be the in thing for a while. But there are some critical differences between Jessica Rabbit and Sarah and what we can glean from Madonna versus what happens with Elise. The fact is, with any other example that I could find, the inherent absurdity of a cartoon-human relationship is part of the premise, and it's always played up, at least on some level, how silly a concept this is. But Sonic 06 plays it straight as an arrow. The game is absolutely, positively, unyieldingly sincere in its portrayal. It's as if audiences were expected to find absolutely nothing even a little off about it, and that total lack of self-awareness makes it so much more unsettling. And look, Elise planting a magical kiss of life on Sonic will always be the most memorable scene of the game for all the wrong reasons. But I'd argue that even if Elise was, I don't know, a badger mole or something, this would still be an uncomfortably awkward pairing. The way Sonic himself is written is as much a part of that as anything else. He doesn't outwardly reciprocate Elise's feelings, but he doesn't reject them either, and seeing the character act this way just seems forced for the sake of romance. Across all his myriad of universes, Sonic had always been portrayed as direct and straightforward. He doesn't have the patience for anything else, so what you see is what you get. But here, what you see is hard to get, and that's no good. Elise being a human lady makes it worse than it would be, of course, but even then, she's only the most visible example of the complete aesthetic breakdown that permeates the game's entire setting. You could jettison the romance out of the plot completely, and it would still be awkward to see the cartoonishly elongated Sonic characters hanging out with such rote, conventional humans. It makes it all the more uncanny and, lady? Are you making a pass at Tails? Well, it was acceptable in the 80s, and maybe this sort of thing is just kinda routine in the Kingdom of Soliana. And I mean, maybe that even makes sense. After all, the cartoony animal characters in universe are clearly perfectly sapient, and more than capable of making their own decisions. So, I guess, whatever floats your boat, right? Who am I to judge? As long as you're not hurting anyone, you do you, lady. Except for one minor problem. Tails is 8 years old, you psycho! At least Sonic and Elise are about the same age. The fact is, shoehorning a fairy tale love story into the centerpiece of the plot of a Sonic game isn't just stupid, it's a complete tonal mismatch for the character and the series. But I will give the game some small measure of credit. On the rare occasion that she's not being held captive, or gallivanting around with Sonic on the Windows XP background, Elise's backstory and character is given a surprising amount of depth and focus. Surprising in that she has any at all, but she does end up being the most well-defined, well-characterized person in this mess. If Elise hadn't been so irrevocably tied to Sonic, if she had just been her own character with a little more agency, this princess of a kingdom under siege, struggling to live up to the unrealistic expectations put upon her, and above all, if she had never, ever done this, then Elise might be remembered as one of the few bright spots in this disaster of a plot. Still not great, still not something at all suited for a Sonic game, but a hypothetical bright spot is a hypothetical bright spot. Sonic and Elise are usually, and fairly, the most criticized part of the story. But aside from Elise, the overarching plot is basically just another take on the adventure games. What with its ancient prophesized monster of legend with cataclysmic power that suddenly betrays Eggman, it's just that now the stakes are even higher because reality itself is threatened and time travel is involved, so things get to be even more confounding. But as complex as it aspires to be, the individual beats of the plot tend to be weirdly repetitive and formulaic. There's a menagerie of cutscenes, but they carry a mere smattering of plot. I get the feeling that a lot of it was thrown together at the 11th hour in some hopeless attempt to tie together a bunch of disparate level archetypes. I get that feeling about most of the game, really. It's making every attempt to make all these tonally incompatible elements work, and there is simply no time to make that happen. For instance, this was meant to be the darkest, most epic, most serious story that Sonic had ever seen, and it would be carried by the limitless talent of 4Kids Entertainment. That's not really fair to the voice actors, though. They do as good a job as they can, given the circumstances. This was the first mainline game in the series to feature the English voice actors from Sonic X. And yep, they sure sound like they're from an early 2000s anime dub. Except for Mike Pollock's Eggman. He always does an amazing job and has become one of my favorite voices for the character, but it's just weird here, listening to him play this more subdued version of Eggman, trying to sound vaguely, yet not enough, like a real person. And then you've got Jason Griffith as Sonic. In complete contrast to Eggman, I guess. He constantly sounds like he's trying really hard to sound cool. There's absolutely none of that laid-back, self-assured flippancy that once made the character cool. So in other words, Jason Griffith is the perfect Sonic for this era, and I can't imagine anyone else pulling this off. The plot is great. Well, I've come to know myself a little better in the past 11 years, and I think what I really meant was, the pre-rendered cutscenes were pretty, and I don't care enough about the story to let it affect my opinion. I might not have had a keen sense of it back then, but gameplay is the reason I do this. And in 2007, I called on 13 years of experience in the field with my very next line. The levels are fun. Well, that makes sense. I mean, some of them are pretty fun. Provided, of course, that you know how to play them. The only problem with that is, knowing how to play Sonic 06 means knowing with a completely irrational degree of precision exactly how to avoid each and every one of its unending cavalcade of death traps.
Gotta make sure I don't fall in the water. No!
Don't try to take those loops in Wave Ocean. The homing attack snaps to rail, so don't try to hit launch rings with it. The skateboard can only jump properly in certain locations. Make sure you hit this Mobius strip at the perfect angle, or you'll get flung into the ocean. And how do you learn any of this? There's only one way. Trial and freaking error. Nowhere is this more true than the Mach speed sections, where Sonic automatically blasts forward with a velocity that he just doesn't bother using anywhere else. Mach speed is uncontrollable and unpredictable and unfair. There is absolutely no way that anyone would be able to play these for the first time without making a ton of mistakes. And in every single case, the game would be the one at fault. And what makes that even worse is that every one of those errant mistakes costs you dearly. The ring system is still in play, but with no way to turn around, there's no hope of picking them up. And yet, for some insane reason, colliding with objects hurts you now. So every time you hit a wall, or stub your toe on a fence, or get barraged by a confounding myriad of physics objects, you are immediately left one single hit away from death. And God help you if you misjudge the terrain, or the game just bugs out, and Sonic ends up somewhere he's not supposed to be. More than anything else in this game, every single beat of a Mach speed level is yet another opportunity for Sonic 06's total lack of quality control to drive you to insanity. It's a marathon of inequitable set pieces. You'd have to be some kind of masochist to put yourself through this. So, of course, in 2007, I described these as some of my favorite parts now that I've gotten good at them. And I mean, yeah, Josh in 07 was right on the money there. These are some of my favorite parts. The Mach speed sections might be like a marathon of QuickTime events minus the button prompts. They might be totally impenetrable without an insulting amount of trial and error, but maybe I'm the kind of person who kind of enjoys that? Maybe you wouldn't have to be a masochist to have fun with this. Maybe all you'd have to be is a very specific kind of Sonic fan. I'm not sure the terms are mutually exclusive. The thing is, I do tend to earnestly enjoy blatantly, purposefully unfair games, like I Want to Be the Guy or Getting Over It, and failing in them time after time never does make me rage or even get me frustrated. Sometimes half the fun is failing. so that's definitely part of it. But what helps just as much is, like the proverbial frog brought to boil, I had kind of been conditioned into this, because a ton of Sonic 06's most glaring defects are systemic issues that took root all the way back in Sonic Adventure 1. Back in that episode, I said that one reason I still enjoy that game so much is because I learned how to avoid the instability. But that's no excuse. Learning how not to break the game still shouldn't be the player's responsibility. But in 1999, in an era when the industry was still figuring out how to do 3D, it was easy to overlook the necessity of learning your way around a few rough edges. But by 2006, a game that expected you to account for not just a handful of inconsistencies, but an unceasing parade of defective nonsense, was completely unacceptable. Every single section of every single level is a new chance for the game to break, and you win by figuring out how to make it not do that. It plays like the unfinished, unpolished garbage it is, unless you've grinded your way through to the point that you can do the same thing Sega's marketing did and make it look, kinda passable, sometimes. But remember, I was having a stupidly good time just finding all of those defects, and learning how to avoid them was just one more step. So to me, really, I can have fun with this game. But what constitutes fun is subjective. Just because I'm the kind of person who can wrangle some form of enjoyment out of it doesn't mean it's actually any good. It just means that I'm particularly attuned to finding some small measure of its potential. And at first, that was enough. At first, my nostalgia-fueled adulation for the series was so insanely high, and my expectations were so impossibly low, that Sonic 06 didn't have any trouble exceeding them. This was the first next-gen game I had ever played, and even though I had to replay Crisis City 7 or 8 times, because that tornado was carrying a car, I had still never seen a video game that could do that. But as the sheen of the next generation faded, Sonic 06's flaws became so much more glaring. It had taken me just 4 days to get to the end of Sonic's story, but finishing the other 2/3 of the game, that took a little while longer. Sonic 06 becomes, somehow, so much more unpalatable when you have to play as anyone besides Sonic, which is unfortunate, because multiple characters are baked into the levels themselves now. These so-called amigo characters were a pretty good idea in concept. If they were properly executed, they might have avoided the disparity of the adventure game's efforts while still delivering the variety afforded by the approach. But this is a game where the only thing that was properly executed was Sonic Team's reputation. So of course, the amigo characters are even more blatantly unfinished than the rest of the game. Their movesets are undercooked, their collision detection is raw, and Tails' movement speed is, as if he's baked? Speaking of which, the only exception to the rule is Blaze. Seriously, Blaze the freaking cat inexplicably has the most useful, varied, momentum-driven moveset of any character in the game, and you get to play as her 3 times. As for the other hedgehogs, Shadow stages tend to be more focused on combat and puzzle solving. So that's where the rest of Sonic Heroes went. And instead of mock speed sections, Shadow gets vehicles. Yeehaw! In a better game, this could represent a more traditional take on an exploratory 3D platformer. In this game, all you've done is remove the main thing that was making it kind of enjoyable. For me. Silver's campaign, on the other hand, wasn't just boring, it was absolutely, frustratingly tedious. It featured the same sort of unpolished, unfinished, utterly broken bull crap that the rest of the game pulled, but it's so much more of a problem when your entire moveset and progression through a stage is defined by a physics engine that does not work. Silver's gameplay style isn't even trying to be like a Sonic game, and oh, this must be how people who don't like 3D Sonic to begin with feel when they play this game. That makes a lot of sense. But hey, if the game's so much worse when you don't play as Sonic, then that's just another glitchy, unfair obstacle that I had to learn to overcome. Sonic's version of Kingdom Valley has a section where you are normally forced to play as Silver, but I don't want to do that. Don't worry, the purple gem upgrade makes Sonic shrink, and as everyone knows, tiny hedgehogs have the ability to fly. So why walk into Silver and do his dumb, bad, boring section when you could just moon jump over the entire thing? There we go. It's really clever of the developers to give experienced, skillful players who understand the underlying rules of the game the freedom to sequence break like this. Make no mistake, Sonic 2006 is a comedy of errors that earns every bit of its reputation. And yet, even to this day, Even playing through it again now, I find that I still have a strange amount of affection for it. And not just in a guilty pleasure so bad it's good way like I do with Sonic R. More than that, I find this game to be a fascinating case study in unrealized potential, especially because of how catastrophically wrong it turned out in spite of what it could have been. This is something that wasn't available to players in 2006, but by installing the game to an SSD, I was able to save approximately 4 seconds on each and every loading screen, which probably saved me literally dozens of hours. Maybe that's why I played way more of the optional town missions than anyone ever has before. In nearly every instance, this was a pointless, uninspired waste of time. Bash some bots, run through rings, blah blah blah. The missions are, of course, repetitive, poorly thought out busy work in a game whose sheer brokenness already gives it way more than enough padding. But there is one diamond hiding in that rough. I give you Sonic Man! A regular human who's decided that he's Sonic the Hedgehog and wants to prove it by outracing the real thing. He even runs like that. I didn't know me from high school was in this game. Some of the bosses are also pretty impressive, relative to the rest of it. By some of the bosses, I really just mean the ones where you fight Eggman. They're a little more focused, I guess, and they show off the increased scope and scale that the next generation consoles could handle. Every level in the game might be a teeth-gnashing grind to get through, but their issues arise from how utterly broken the engine itself is. The level design, on the other hand, tends to be pretty good both structurally and thematically. This is still the closest the series has ever come to a non-linear approach to level design. The open-ended approach that some stages take, and sometimes even the sophistication of their multiple paths, haven't really been matched, or for that matter, even attempted since. And as much as this game falters, I kind of love the way it's forced to revel in its own absurdity. I love that the slide upgrade is called Anti-Gravity, in an attempt to justify why it looks like that. I love how hilariously broken the gym system is, how this meter is completely pointless. I love that gym where you enter a first-person view, throw an object, and just run around until BOOM! You get pulled across time and space to wherever it happened to land. I love that Sonic 06 is one of the few console games of this era, and the only Sonic game on the 360, to actually target 60 frames per second. It doesn't always get there, but hey, at least it tries. I love Kingdom Valley. Far and away, this is my favorite stage in the game. There's a reason they used this one for the demo. I especially love its Mach Speed section, and how creative and fantastical and just beautiful it is. The first time I ever played it, not only was I blown away visually, I finished it without ever taking a hit. That's really not unusual though. That's just how good you'll be at Mach Speed if you make it this far. But honestly, I still had a ways to go. Between the time the game was released and the time I finally played it, I had started college, and I had dropped out. Twice. I couldn't hold down a conventional job to save my life, but I also couldn't even begin to rally the focus and effort it would take to pursue my dreams. When I wrote those words, I was a directionless, unfocused, emotional, immature mess of a 19-year-old who had nothing but ambition. And at the time, I guess it seemed appropriate that a series that had meant so much to me was going through some turmoil too. As sad as it was to see what Sonic had become, I felt like I was right there with him. It's no wonder I had such an affection for it, because as much as it might falter, Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 is always an indulgence in that same kind of naive, reckless, foolhardy ambition, with seemingly its only objective being, well, exactly what Yuji Naka said it would be. This was supposed to be the game that would redefine Sonic the Hedgehog for a new era, and it succeeded. Sonic 06 marks the end of the adventure era, and it is the ultimate result of Sonic Team's complete and utter failure to correct for the sins of that era. It was meant to be for this new generation what Sonic Adventure was for the last. A tremendously ambitious game that showed off every single thing that the new hardware could do. Ambition is an admirable quality, but that alone is insufficient. Ambition is nothing without focus and effort, and in this case, time, because to ring a phrase, a rushed game is forever bad. And that, more than anything else, is the reason Sonic 06 turned out the way it did. It's the ultimate example of the kind of repercussions that can happen when a publisher fails to take that message to heart. Achieving ambition also takes talent, but I submit that Sonic Team did have the talent. The game's concept was forged with the full might of Sonic Team behind it, but midway through development, the team was effectively cut in half. Sega discovered that Nintendo's Wii wouldn't be realistically capable of running a game like this, and split off a chunk of the dev team to begin work on a completely separate project. Then, we were blindsided by unprecedented news. Yuji Naka announced his immediate resignation from Sega, and just like that, this visionary genius of a programmer who had always acted as the driving force of the franchise was gone, and the final remnant of the original Sonic team was no more. At this point, not only was Sonic 06 left with a skeleton crew, but the crew had lost its captain. The only option that should have been on the table was to take a step back and figure out what was needed to correct course. If that meant delaying the game for another year and getting it done right, then so much the better. But instead, Sega insisted that the game was absolutely required to be ready for Sonic's 15th anniversary year, and more importantly, ready for holiday 2006. And so Sonic Team could not spend the final, crucial months of development on quality control. They were forced to ignore bug testing reports and even cut features that made it into the demo, in a futile effort to at least finish the basic outline of what had been promised. Sega did a spectacular job in their marketing of obfuscating just how badly development was going, but they were only covering for their own short-sighted decisions. It's easy to see this as a greedy attempt to capitalize on the series' brand recognition and reputation to get a guaranteed million seller out the door for Christmas, quality be damned. It's easy to see it that way because that's exactly what it was. But I don't think there was any way that Sega, or anyone, could have predicted just how badly it would turn out at the time. After all, this series had seen plenty of ups and downs before. Strapped for time and with a dev team that was sinking, Sega decided to effectively punt on a bad game. There'd always be next time, right? But Sonic 06 was not just a bad game. We'd seen worse than this before. And it wasn't just an ill-conceived, mature reboot of a retro franchise. Those were kind of a dime a dozen in this era. And yet, as games like these have fallen into obscurity, Sonic 06 has endured. Why? Most of the time, a bad game is the result of an apathetic, directionless, or inexperienced dev team churning out a mediocre product. Most of the time, the worst thing a video game can be is boring. But Sonic 06, for all of its problems, is never boring. And that's not always a good thing. Sonic 06's fatal flaw is that all the things that make it so horrible are absolutely captivating. The ambition that should have been its driving strength instead became its undoing. It was utterly fascinating how bad it was, and it just so happened to come out at the worst possible time to be that. After all, this was the same year that Time magazine named you, as in you on the internet, you writing a blog, you making videos on YouTube, you as its Person of the Year. It was the same year this nerd came to prominence, and with that, angry, vitriolic rage was the guiding principle upon which amateur game criticism was founded. Nobody, myself included, could get enough of critics hilariously burning down abominable video games. And it didn't take long to discover that Sonic 06 was an infinitely renewable source of fuel. Every single person who plays it, whether they're a Sonic fan or not, is guaranteed to run into the same ridiculous problems. The romantic focus of the story was cringe-inducing right at the time that so-called cringe culture embodied gamer culture. Sonic might have been an icon, but the brand recognition that Sega relied on to sell copies also meant that there was a built-in audience of fans and haters alike ready to see the game torn to shreds. Individual talent is barely even a factor. Just looking at stuff like this is engaging. I don't know if it's even possible to point out this game's flaws without it being entertaining. And by the way, I'm not at all condemning anyone for taking Sonic 06 to task. The first Let's Play I ever saw was of this game, and I couldn't stop watching it. Some of the best and funniest and most analytical and most thought-provoking commentary that I've ever seen is the result of someone playing this game. However, whether you have ever played it or not, whether you even like this series or not, there is no way that anyone could see this, or this, or this, and ever forget it. The finale of the game seems almost like it has a moment of self-awareness, like it realizes what a consequential, far-reaching mistake it's making. In the end, Elise goes back to the past and extinguishes the flames of disaster, erasing the entire adventure from the timeline. In-universe, none of this ever happened. The game tried to retcon itself out of existence. But alas, here in the real world, nobody who sees this stuff could ever forget it. and everybody saw it, and nobody forgot it. This is still the very first thing that a lot of people even think about when they think of Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic 06's notoriety has become a lethal dose of poison injected into the reputation of not just the series, but of Sega itself. And those repercussions could be felt as soon as the very next game. Sonic Team would be compelled to try to eliminate the poison by removing every horrible element of Sonic 06. But those were the very things that had, until this point, defined 3D Sonic. But the only way to break free was to break the mold, so the more serious tone and setting were gone. The abundance of playable characters and their variety of gameplay styles were dropped. It would be more than a decade before a mainline 3D game would even let you play as anyone besides Sonic. The Adventure Era, and its crazy, overconfident pursuit of endless, albeit blind ambition, was dead, and Sonic 06 was the game that killed it. Sonic would continue to have ups and downs, and it would continue to try to be too many things, but it would never be like this again. As much as this would impact the series' future, that poison seeped into the series' past as well. Sonic the Hedgehog, in its time, was a game so radically, disruptively different than what had come before that it single-handedly allowed a scrappy little company that nobody believed in to upend the monopoly that Nintendo had on the industry. But when someone who is the same age now, as I was when I wrote this, decides to make a video about that revolutionary, groundbreaking, important game, he calls it the birth of a laughingstock.
Don't bring me into this, Josh.
I'm sorry, whose video is this? If you'd let me finish, I was gonna say, sadly, he's right about that. Sonic is a laughingstock, and has been since 2006. In the 12 years since that fateful day, generations of gamers who never played a Sega console, who never knew Sonic as any sort of icon have come of age. To them, all this character has ever been is a joke, a laughingstock, a relic who got his start in a collection of very old platformers that were never really that good to begin with. To so many people, this is a series that never managed to make the leap to 3D, and it's something that should have been put out of its misery a long time ago. Sonic 06 is the reason that Sega could release a trio of games that might have been considered a return to form for any other series, and yet nobody remembers them as anything but an aberration. It's the reason that Renaissance never took hold, just as much as it's the reason that nobody remembers the Renaissance that could have been. Heroes didn't make people forget the year of Sonic. This did. So it went, so it would go. Every success was overlooked. Every failure was amplified. And the legacy of every single game that I grew up playing, that I grew up loving, all of the memories that form the core of the reason I do this, in this series that made me a gamer, the series that gave me this dream, the character who was my childhood hero, the legacy of Sonic the Hedgehog was erased from the timeline, and the only thing left was bullshit.